Welcome back. Today we're going to start our course topics, and let us begin with Unit 1-1. In this unit, we will cover three things. First, basic concepts and principles of experimental design. Second, you have sampling techniques. And third, statistical inference. In the first topic, we will talk about the strategy of experiments and relevant basic statistical concepts, as well as some guiding principles that will help practitioners in planning for and implementing designed experiments. Next, we review principles of sampling and the different sampling techniques that are used in experimentation. And lastly, we will discuss the basic concepts of and general process for conducting statistical inference. One of the most pressing needs of our world nowadays is to develop a vaccine against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Scientists and engineers all over the globe have been working to develop a vaccine within a shortened timeline. While this is being done, health workers on the ground continuously innovate on ways to deal with the ongoing flow of COVID-19 patients into hospitals and other healthcare centers. There are several stages in vaccine development, and the entire process usually takes an average of 10 years. This development timeline must be shortened significantly during the pandemic period, as shown in this figure from the New England Journal of Medicine. From preclinical trial to clinical development up to manufacturing, several experiments are designed and conducted to understand how patients respond to the vaccine and to ensure that the vaccine will function in the way that it is intended. Engineers and scientists use statistics and probability concepts to design each of these experiments. For instance, they have to decide on the sample to work with. From the 7.8 billion people in the world today, there is a population of people afflicted with the virus and those who are not. And engineers and scientists have to decide who and how many from these populations to work with in their experiments. They have to make sure that in the process of selecting, these samples will be representative of the humans in the world so as to ensure maximum efficacy of the vaccine and to minimize potential risks. In engineering, there are three broad types of statistical studies that can be conducted. First, you have retrospective studies, which make use of historical data, and objectives include understanding how the system works, as well as how input factors affect the process and output factors. Second, you have observational studies where, as the name implies, you observe how a process or system naturally behaves without intervention. And third, which is the focus of this course, you have designed experiments. In this type, the study involves controlling several parameters of the experiment, such as input factors, to determine how the system behaves. In general, a process or system consists of inputs, the process, and the output. Some of the inputs are controllable factors. Conversely, some are uncontrollable. Now, the process or system can be a combination of manpower, machines, operations, methods, and other resources that transform the input into the output Y, which has one or more observable response variables. Some of the process variables and material properties are controllable, which are denoted here as the X variables, while some are uncontrollable, which are denoted here as the Z variables. These uncontrollable variables, however, can be controlled for the purpose of the experiment. Experiments are done to understand how changes to controllable system inputs affect system outputs. Going back to the COVID-19 pandemic we are experiencing, innovations in the healthcare sector occur at different scales, speeds, and with different objectives that are informed by results from experiments. In these experiments, controllable input factors could include the type and amount of drug administered, while system outputs could include changes in COVID-19 patient health status. These experiments lead to theories and hypotheses about how the virus spreads, how a vaccine could help immunize people against the virus, as well as what kind of interventions work for different levels of COVID-19 severity. Now, designed experiments can help engineers and scientists achieve various objectives, including determining which variables are most influential to the response Y, determining where to set the influential X's so that Y is almost always at the necessary nominal value. Third, determining where to set the influential X's so that variability in Y is small. And four, determining where to set the influential X's so that the effects of the uncontrollable variables Z's are minimized. Now, whatever the objective of your experiment is, it is important to design it properly. It is important to determine your strategy of experimentation or your approach to planning and conducting the experiment. Your approach will determine what data you will collect and how you do this. Ultimately, the process of collection will affect the quality of your data, which will in turn affect conclusions you derive from the experiment, as well as the time and resources that you will be needing. Now, there are three general strategies of experimentation, which include the best guess approach, one factor at a time or OFAT, and the factorial experiments. Okay, now consider the Gulf experiment example of Montgomery in his book, Design and Analysis of Experiments, to familiarize yourself with the different strategies of experimentation. In this course, we will focus on factorial experiments. In factorial experiments, you basically deal with two or more factors. And the controllable factors under consideration are varied to capture both main and interaction effects. Main effects are the individual effects of each factor, while the interaction effects are the combined effects of the different factors. Generally, if we are considering K factors, okay, with 2 levels each, we denote it as a 2 to the K factorial experiment and would need 2 to the K runs. In some cases, an experimenter can conduct more runs to have replicates or runs of the same combination of factor levels. However, in some cases, such as when there are too many factors that are being investigated, the number of needed runs can become too high and therefore resource intensive. The technique called fractional factorial experiment enables the experimenter to not run all the 2 to the K factorial 2 to the K possible combinations of factor levels. This technique is a variation of the basic factorial design, wherein only a subset of the runs is used. Because of its efficiency, fractional factorial designs are used widely in industrial R&D and for process improvements. Now, the employment of experimental design, especially in early product or process development, can result in several benefits. These include improved process yield, reduced variability and closer conformance to nominal or target requirements, reduced development time, and reduced overall cost. And there are several applications of experimental design in engineering design. Some of these include evaluation and comparison of basic design configuration, evaluation of material alternatives, selection of design parameters so that the product will work under a wide variety of conditions, that is, so that the product will become robust, determination of key product design parameters, and formulation of new products. Okay, so for your homework, read examples 1.1 to 1.6 in Design and Analysis of Experiments by Montgomery to familiarize yourself with the different applications of experimental design. Now, now that we've talked about the importance and applications of experimental design, as well as the different strategies to experimentation, let's move on to statistical design of experiments. What is a statistical design of experiments? It is basically the process of planning the experiment in order to collect the appropriate data and properly analyze this data using statistical methods. And then by doing so, you obtain valid and objective conclusions. Now remember that there are two aspects of an experimental problem. The first one is the design of the experiment, and the second one is the statistical analysis of the data. Needless to say, these two are closely related. Your method of analysis will depend directly on the experimental design that you adopted. So let's first talk about the principles of experimental design. There are three fundamental principles. One, you have randomization. Two, you have replication. And three, you have locking. The first principle is very important. In fact, it is considered the cornerstone underlying statistical methods in experimental design. It means that when designing an experiment, both the allocation of experimental material and the order in which runs are performed do not follow any pattern. That is, they are randomly determined. In statistical methods, it is required that observations or errors are independently distributed random variables. And randomization helps ensure that this assumption is valid. So let's look at a simple example, the quenching solution and alloy hardness example from Montgomery. Suppose that a metallurgical engineer is interested in studying the effect of oil quenching versus saltwater quenching on an aluminum alloy. In particular, the engineer, who is the experimenter, wants to identify the quenching solution that will result in maximum aluminum alloy hardness. Before you proceed, you might want to take a pause to ask what could be the important questions that you should be asking when designing this experiment. Okay, but in the context of the discussion on principles of experimental design, in particular randomization, let's think about these following questions. First, what if the specimen or the alloy coupons that you are testing the media with, okay, differ slightly in thickness? And what if thickness actually affects effectiveness of the quenching medium? What could happen if thicker coupons are subjected only to the oil quench? And what do you think should be done? Okay, we will continue Unit 1 in the next video.